The Honjo Masamune is the ultimate samurai sword. In Japan, it's regarded as a national treasure, a thing of beauty, shaped by fire, a thing of power, born of water. Forged centuries ago by master swordsmith Masamune.
If it's a Masamune, it's almost like having crown jewels.
Proven in battle for centuries. Legend tells of a just blade, discerning and honorable. It was venerated as the hereditary sword of power by the ruling shoguns. Passed from generation to generation for 700 years. But in the aftermath of the Second World War, it disappeared.
It is the vanished embodiment of Japanese tradition and an object of great desire.
Records tell us a mysterious US sergeant took it to be destroyed. But some say he saved it and took it home to America. Now worth millions of dollars, experts believe it may still be out there.
I still somehow feel that it still does exist, possibly unrecognized.
This is the story of the ancient legendary Honjo Masamune, lost sword of the samurai. In the late 13th century, the rulers of Kamakura province near Tokyo had a serious problem. The invading Mongol hordes of Kublai Khan. Under the onslaught, their weapons simply weren't up to the task.
When the Mongol invasion happened, Japanese swords were nice, slender, beautiful-looking things, but they broke on the Mongol armour.
To solve this problem, they turned to swordsmith Nayudo Masamune. Masamune's task was to redesign the Japanese sword to withstand the armor and kill the Mongol invaders. Masamune developed techniques that have never been surpassed. First, Masamune beat red-hot high-carbon steel into a thick rectangular billet. Then cutting and folding it again and again, he forged a blade composed of over 30,000 layers. To the thick back edge and the thin cutting edge, he gave very different properties. And these were born not from the heat of the fire, but how the steel cooled in water.
The cutting edge, because it hardened quickly, is very, very hard, almost as hard as glass, but it's brittle.
The thicker, heavier back edge gave up its heat more slowly. This changed the structure of the iron itself, making it far less hard but more flexible than the vulnerable sharp edge.
The back, because it cools slowly, is tough and malleable, and it supports and stops that brittle edge cracking.
In battle, the thin edge was used offensively to cut. It is rigid and razor sharp, and the back used defensively as a shield. Its flexible spine absorbing impact. But to withstand the Mongol armor, Masamune also made his blades broader from edge to back for strength, the point longer to pierce, and the hardened edge deeper to aid repair. And so, Masamune brought the samurai sword to the peak of perfection, exemplified by the Honjo Masamune. Not just a weapon, but a work of art, an object of beauty. And Masamune's name still resonates throughout Japan today.
He's known to school children in Japan. They might know nothing else about Japanese swords, but his name is known.
Over the centuries, many legends have grown up about the great Masamune and the magical qualities of his swords. One of Masamune's pupils thought that after many years' training, he had surpassed his master. To test the quality of their respective blades, they suspended them in a stream. The student's blade was so sharp that it cut leaves and twigs, everything in its path. Masamune's blade, just as sharp, cut nothing. The student claimed victory, but a bystander disagreed. He observed that Masamune's blade did not cut needlessly. It was discerning and honorable, a just blade.
Masamune is generally given the titles Goro Nayudo, which have Buddhist implications, suggesting he was of the priesthood, or at least a devout follower of Buddha.
His finest work, the Honjo Masamune, was primarily a weapon for cutting human flesh. And the samurai would develop a very practical method for testing blades.
For a fee, an official tester would use a blade on a corpse from the execution grounds and report back to the owner on how it cut and how it behaved and how many bodies and which particular part of the body to cut.
The edge was sharp and the back strong, but yet another key property made the sword so deadly: its curve.
Swords were made curved because they cut flesh better when they're curved. There's a slicing action that's automatically built into the cut.
There are diagrams which show the various cuts that were tested.
The easiest was to chop through a wrist or an ankle. The most difficult would be through the pelvic girdle or the shoulder girdle, and diagonally down through the rib cage, cuts like that.
As a permanent record, the test results would be carved into the sword's tang under the mounted grip.
It shows that these swordsmiths had a great concern, not only just for the look of their swords, but of the effectiveness of their swords.
History doesn't record precisely when Masamune drew from his furnace the greatest blade he ever made, the Honjo Masamune. Around the year 1300 is the closest anyone can say. Nothing is known of its early life or battles, who wore it proudly in his belt, or who inherited it over the centuries. Such a fine sword would have played an important part in the rigid social structure of feudal Japan, in which everyone knew their place.
At the top was the shogun, who was if you like, a military dictator. Below him would be various large landowners.
The powerful landowning lords, the daimyos, were protected by the knightly class, the samurai. The name literally means one who serves.
The soul of a samurai is to serve. The soul of a samurai is to wait. The soul of a samurai is to follow his lord, until such time as his lord may want him.
The sword was an essential part of a samurai's dress, the uniform of his class. The long sword was a large part of who he was.
The sword was something more than just a weapon. It was his most prized possession. It was described as the soul of the samurai.
The sword was an important thing for the samurai because it was their badge of rank. It was their status symbol, if you like.
Just as a samurai's life belonged to his lord, lives of those with a lower rank, farmers and peasants, belonged to him.
The samurai were allowed to to cut down anybody without any excuse. If you insulted me and you were a peasant, I could just cut you down and that was it.
The Honjo Masamune first enters recorded history when, 300 years after it was made, it got its name. In the 16th century, in battle, General Honjo Shigenaga was attacked by an enemy with Masamune's masterpiece. The sword had already claimed a number of trophy heads that day, but General Honjo Shigenaga prevailed, and finally victorious took the sword as his prize. From then on, it bears his name, Honjo Masamune. Soon afterwards, General Shigenaga was ordered to Fushimi Castle. But short of money, he sold the now priceless sword for 13 large gold coins. At today's gold prices, around £2,500. It was now that the Honjo Masamune was transformed from a valued weapon to priceless symbol of absolute power. The superlative sword became the ultimate gift to pass up the social ladder to nobles of ascending rank as a token of esteem. Eventually, it was received in tribute by warlord Tokugawa Ieyasu. With the Honjo Masamune at his side, Tokugawa Ieyasu was about to change the course of Japanese history. Japan was being torn apart by civil war. Daimyo against daimyo, samurai against samurai, each fighting loyally for his lord to the death. Finally, in 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu amassed enough military power to seize overall control. He made the emperor a mere figurehead. Ieyasu himself would rule all Japan as military dictator. He would be the shogun.
Japan was at war for 150 years between the 15th and the 16th centuries. And the great Tokugawa achievement is to make peace break out, if you like.
The Tokugawa shoguns brought 250 years of peace to Japan. And their ceremonial sword was the Honjo Masamune. Over the centuries, the hereditary sword of the shoguns was passed from generation to generation. Even after the Tokugawas fell from power in 1868, the great sword continued to be handed down within the aristocratic family into the 20th century. In 1939 in Tokyo, it was designated a Japanese national treasure, a survivor of 700 years of turbulent history. It was only in the upheaval of the Second World War that the mystery of the Honjo Masamune begins, when it disappeared. Japan entered World War II in 1941 with a surprise attack on the US Navy anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. As Japan poured millions of troops into battle, the High Command boosted recruitment and morale by fostering the ideals of Japan's ancient past, Bushido, the way of the warrior, and the heroic exploits of the samurai. So they gave out swords.
If you were recruiting people from backgrounds which had no military history whatsoever, the simple act of recruiting them, giving them a sword, or allowing them to wear a sword and carry a sword was, in a way, elevating them in status and giving them a pride.
Every officer, sergeant and corporal had to wear a sword as part of his uniform. The sheer number required was huge. So these modern military swords were not hand-beaten by master craftsmen in the traditional way.
A lot of swords made for officer class were mass-produced from pieces of steel, usually a piece of railway line. A lot were made in factories. All of the swords made for NCOs were mass-produced in factories from ordinary steel.
By the Second World War, there are estimated to have been as many as 2 million swords worn by the Japanese military. The symbolism of the sword continued to be promoted in Japanese propaganda throughout World War II. This pilot on the cover of Japanese propaganda magazine Front in 1943 carries his sword center frame as a symbol of honor, justice, and fighting spirit.
It's a very well-informed, very well-composed, highly artistic, and very effective image. But it's not true. This is not how pilots got into planes. This is staged. But samurai myths about sacrifice become very useful for steeling yourself before you are going to get into the cockpit of a plane in which you are probably going to die.
For the Japanese, war was a fight to the death. The emperor and the government could not countenance surrender. On August the 6th and 9th, 1945, American B-29 aircraft dropped a nuclear bomb on 2 Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Just 6 days later, the Japanese had to bear the unbearable, think the unthinkable. They surrendered.
Across the radio comes the voice of the emperor, which nobody's heard before. And it's a very strange voice, it's a very high voice, it's a very weak voice. He's talking in a language that most of them don't understand. But the message is clear. We've lost.
At the end of the Second World War, the average Japanese person would have been totally devastated by having suffered defeat, a loss of face. But on the other hand, the war was over, and the hardship they'd been through, the firebombing, the starvation, was finished.
Not for the first time in Japanese history, the emperor had to move aside for a powerful shogun. Shogun is a very old title in Japanese history. It means not just military commander, but supreme dictator. And the man the United States sent to rule occupied Japan was certainly that. 5-star General Douglas MacArthur.
You get this tall, white American stepping out of an airplane in a very theatrical way. He's dressed very particularly, his collar is open, you know, and this is the new guy in town. MacArthur was a dictator, and he was the supreme commander. It's a time of chaos, and MacArthur's there to do a very particular job, and he's very aware of the job he's going to do. He's very charismatic, he's very savvy. There's a very famous photograph, for example, of MacArthur standing next to the emperor in morning coat, looking incredibly formal. MacArthur again with the open shirt collar and towering over him. And of course it's a way of making a very profound statement.
MacArthur officially accepted the Japanese surrender in a ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September 1945.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past.
As soon as the surrender was signed, MacArthur, as Supreme Commander Allied Powers, set to work. He issued SCAP General Order No. 1, the immediate surrender of all Japanese armed forces. MacArthur demanded they cease hostilities and lay down their arms.
At the beginning of the occupation, though, there are two main objectives. The first, the urgent one, is demilitarization. You have to take the stuff away, you have to make sure they don't do it again.
MacArthur's plan was to make sure Japan could never wage war again. Total demilitarization and disarmament were paramount.
They destroyed a lot of honest-to-God modern military material, planes and so on and so forth. They also collected a lot of gunpowder, which of course has its uses. They just collected everything.
MacArthur soon destroyed hundreds of ships and thousands of planes. But what should he do with all those swords? Every Japanese officer, sergeant and corporal carried one at his side. There were millions of them, but MacArthur was determined to collect every one. Not because the swords were a military threat, but because of their enduring symbolic importance.
Certainly, taking away weapons is one way of demonstrating your authority. And of course, the sword is not, in the end, a weapon. It's a symbolic statement about authority. It's the thing that somebody would carry who was in charge. So to take the symbol of authority away is important.
All over the Pacific, surrender ceremonies were organized by the victorious Allies. On parade grounds in Sumatra, Burma, and Malaya, Japanese fighting men suffered the humiliation of surrendering their treasured swords to the Americans.
Your government, regarding military swords as weapons, does not acknowledge the wearing of swords as dress, and we have been ordered to surrender all kinds of swords. Japanese officers are extremely dejected and troubled.
What the Allies didn't realize was that some of the swords were not modern, mass-produced weapons, but handcrafted antiques of great value.
Some families at the beginning of the war who did own swords that had been in the family for many, many generations and possibly had been used in warfare in the distant past, took them to battle, having picked up a tradition that had been going on for centuries of carrying an ancestor's sword into battle.
Surrendering a venerable family heirloom was especially painful.
I cannot help heaving a deep sigh of sorrow in parting with my most beloved sword, my spirit, with which my ancestors went to war, and which my father himself handed over to me when I set out from home for this war, praying for my heroic victory in every action.
Hundreds of thousands of swords were surrendered, but what to do with them? Some were awarded to Allied officers or to civilians who had distinguished themselves in the war effort. To one, a crude, mass-produced blade, to another, perhaps a centuries-old work of art. The Americans didn't know or care. But most of the swords were not given away. They were destroyed. The SCAP instruction for disarmament applied not only to frontline soldiers, but the people of Japan at home too. Even swords in private hands. The Honjo Masamune in the Tokugawa mansion in Tokyo was no exception.
Collect and deliver all arms in the possession of the Japanese civilian population.
All of the swords in Japan were rounded up into centres, usually warehouses or school gymnasiums, and piled high ready for destruction.
The order to collect all swords meant just that. These seizures were indiscriminate. Family heirlooms decorating homes and masterpieces in collections were commandeered as quickly as military blades.
The people who were handling the swords, who were sweeping them up in the dragnet, were quite low-level functionaries, very hard-pressed for time, as low-level functionaries normally are. They're not colonels with an enormous amount of time on their hand. They don't know what they're dealing with.
The owners of swords were instructed to take them to collection points such as police stations. Even the aristocratic Tokugawa family, who as shoguns once ruled Japan, were not exempt. The SCAP instructions were law, and they were ordered to relinquish all their fine swords, including the legendary Honjo Masamune. In Japan, there was outrage. Would they really have to give it up to the Americans, who appreciated nothing of its history or symbolism? Influential people, collectors and museum curators, were soon complaining to SCAP about this assault on the Japanese heritage.
Very quickly they discover that there's blowback, if you like, that they are being indiscriminate and that they're annoying some people. Of course, they learn more very quickly. They learn that some people don't like having their swords taken away. They learn that there are collectors of Japanese swords who have nice collections, which got caught up in the dragnet.
A key figure in trying to save swords like the Honjo Masamune was Dr. Junji Homma of the Tokyo Museum. He met military police commander Colonel Victor C. Cadwell of the US 8th Army, the officer in charge of weapons collection. Dr. Homma explained that some swords were ancient works of an almost forgotten art, like the cathedrals of the West. A vivid symbol that was an extension of the samurai himself, influencing Japanese art and literature. Dr. Homma argued that they were not military weapons at all. Treasures like the Honjo Masamune were art swords.
It was people like Homma who coined the phrase of Japanese art swords in order to save them from destruction by the occupying forces.
It was essential they were preserved because they were part of Japan's historic artistic inheritance. Then this term art sword was devised.
Homma succeeded and convinced Colonel Cadwell that Japanese swords were not simply wartime weapons and should no longer be treated as such. SCAP Instruction 12 tried to clarify the situation.
You are advised that if these swords are the personal property of those officers concerned, they may be retained on condition that henceforth it will be understood that they have no military significance whatsoever, but are household treasures.
But Cadwell didn't have the final word. As late as November the 11th, 1945, contradictory orders were issued by SCAP.
All swords, including privately owned swords, shall be treated as symbols of militarism and destroyed.
As a result, valuable antique blades continued to be swept up.
Sadly, a lot of very fine traditional swords did go into the melting pot.
Some families protected their heirlooms by deceiving the Americans.
Certain families in Japan deliberately acquired what I can only describe as very poor quality swords and hid their better swords because they knew they were going to be taken by the victors.
But the Tokugawa family did no such thing. They took a very different, honorable course and accepted the latest edict from SCAP. Just before Christmas 1945, the last known owner of the Honjo Masamune, Tokugawa Ieyasu, a descendant of the shoguns, obeyed the law and delivered the family's swords to Majiro police station.
The family still does have ownership of it, and so they can do something useful, which is their duty. Because, of course, the symbolic value of the old military family of Japan, the first military family of Japan, giving up the symbol of their authority to the new occupiers in order that Japan can embark on a new path.
Tokugawa Ieyasu handed in 15 swords, bundled all together. And among them was the finest sword ever made, the Honjo Masamune. Mr. Tokugawa never saw the great family sword again. The Honjo Masamune disappeared and entered the realm of conjecture and mystery. The first clue to what became of the lost sword of the samurai appeared in New York 20 years after the end of World War II. The August 1966 edition of Saga, an American adventure and mystery magazine, contained an article listing Japanese national treasures that went missing after the war. The list of 14 swords included the Honjo Masamune. Here in black and white, it recorded that a Sergeant Coldy Bymore of the 7th US Cavalry had collected it from the police station at Majiro. But how reliable was this record? What is undoubtedly true is that the 7th Cavalry patrols were in Tokyo and did make inventories of all arsenals, factories, barracks, and storage depots. They also disposed of munitions and conducted patrols in search of hidden Japanese weapons, including swords. This corroborates the Saga magazine article. The next question is, did Sergeant Coldy Bymore take the sword from the police station? Unfortunately, all police records for the period in question are lost. But there is another source, the Japanese Department of Education. Their records at the time make it clear that the Honjo Masamune certainly was taken from Majiro police station by Sergeant Bymore. But where did he take it? All over Japan, collected swords were piled high in warehouses before being dumped at sea or melted down for scrap iron. In Tokyo, for Sergeant Coldy Bymore, storage was at the Akabane depot. To avoid the destruction of art swords, every blade at Akabane was scrutinized by Dr. Junji Homa's inspection committee. It was a big success. Nearly 5,000 swords were identified as important cultural artifacts and returned to their owners. But the Honjo Masamune was not among them. Was it fed to the furnace and destroyed? Or did Coldy Bymore keep it for himself?
I think it's most unlikely that the Honjo Masamune sword did go into a melting pot. The Tokugawa, having been shoguns of Japan, and hence at the pinnacle of Japanese society, would have had some extremely fine swords. And I'm pretty sure that even the police in the local police station and the sergeant to which they were handed over to would have recognised the quality of the mountings, if nothing else. And therefore, I suspect they were shipped back to America pretty quickly.
What is certainly true is that the American Army operated an official war trophy system. A GI who had taken part in the Pacific War could, with the correct permission slip, take home one enemy gun and one sword as personal souvenirs. Most of these returning men were carrying mass-produced military swords, nothing special. But some GIs unknowingly had centuries-old works of art of great cultural and monetary value. It's very possible that the Honjo Masamune was taken by Coldy Bymore as his personal memento. If this was true, the question then became, when did Sergeant Bymore get shipped home? And did he carry the Honjo Masamune with him? At this point, the trail becomes even more obscured. 7th Cavalry records should reveal when Sergeant Coldy Bymore left Japan and when he arrived home. But the 7th Cavalry Veterans Association lists no one by that name. Does that mean there never was a Coldy Bymore? The facts are more complicated. The Saga magazine article contains another clue. It describes the name Coldy Bymore as phonetic. This indicates it's a translation from English into Japanese. The strange name Coldy Bymore may be inaccurate.
We're moving between languages. We're moving between languages fast on a busy day when there are 100 different things to do by somebody scribbling in a book. So when you hear the name that's come down to us, the first thing that comes to mind is, this isn't an American name. This is a problem of transliteration.
The Japanese have developed phonetic alphabets to help transcode English and other languages. The characters are not words, as in Japanese, but represent particular sounds. It is not precise.
In order to get the sergeant's name down, what the Japanese sergeant would have done would have been to write his name in a Japanese syllabary, an alphabet, but we call it a syllabary, because it's a way of transliterating English into Japanese.
This system of transliteration is far from perfect, as Japanese sounds don't appear in English, and English sounds have no Japanese equivalent. The name may not be Coldy Bymore, but something that sounds a bit like it.
If you think back to that moment when he wrote it down, it sounds something like Gorudi Baimor, or maybe Bimoru, and actually then transcribing back, because it went both ways. So maybe this is Goldie Beamer, maybe this is Cody, maybe this is Biltmore. God knows. When the American sergeant said, "Oh, my name's Goldie Beamer," the Japanese would say Gorudi Bimaru, and then put it into these characters, which then come back to us in a scrambled form.
So was there a 7th Cavalry Sergeant in Tokyo on the 18th of January 1946 with a name similar to Coldy Bymore? Unfortunately, the scrap records of lowly sergeants have been routinely destroyed. The true name of the sergeant can never be found. But even so, many believe the Honjo Masamune could still turn up. In the years since the war, Americans began to understand the prestige and value of fine Japanese swords properly. President Truman was given a 650-year-old sword in a 350-year-old silk wrapping as a war souvenir. The Allied occupation of Japan continued until 1952, and the influx of swords to America after the Second World War was like a tsunami. For the handful of knowledgeable sword enthusiasts who recognized the characteristics which made a blade great, there was the opportunity to make a lot of money.
I could quite easily buy swords one day for £15 and sell them the next day for £300 or something, which is incredible sort of stuff.
Dealers discovered that hidden in the stream of confiscated weapons, there were historically important swords now scattered all over the US.
In America has still got thousands of swords stashed away in attics, box rooms, garages, which was brought back as trophies and are merely regarded as, oh, Grandad's old sword.
Could the Honjo Masamune be among Grandad's old swords? Since World War II, there have been thousands of ads placed in newspapers all over the US offering to buy Japanese swords. These were the days when a fine collection could still be acquired very cheaply.
In America, especially over the 1970s and 80s, I've heard it termed as the gold rush over there, and people were making fortunes buying, selling swords, and mostly selling them back to Japan.
As this market developed, some important art swords did occasionally turn up. Avid collector Clive Sinclair came by a sword when it surfaced in just this way. Wonderfully preserved, it was made especially for the shogun's chief test cutter.
It turned up in an antique fair, swapped hands for £400. Within half an hour, it's got up to £1,500, and I paid £10,000 for it. And I've spent another £3,000 on it since then. And it's been exhibited in Japan. It's a very good sword.
Could this one day happen to the Honjo Masamune? If it did emerge from someone's attic, how could it be recognized? There is a telltale way of knowing. 700 years ago, when Masamune plunged the hot blade into cold water, he gave birth to a razor-sharp weapon. But he also gave the Honjo Masamune a unique signature.
If a sword turned up that was claimed to be the Honjo Masamune, because it was a national treasure, prior to the war, there were very, very accurate drawings made of its shape, the patterning of the hardened edge, which you could use to compare a sword with, to say, yes, it's the same, or no, it isn't.
For centuries, it was customary for an artist to meticulously draw the unique pattern on the edge of a fine sword, the hamon. When in 1939 the Japanese declared the Honjo Masamune a national treasure, such fine detailed drawings of the hamon were made. If the Honjo Masamune ever appeared at an antiques fair or auction, there could be no mistake. Its fingerprints have been taken.
At this point, perhaps the best way of understanding the meaning of that sword is as an artistic object. So it's made by a famous maker, and it has fabulous provenance. If you go to an auction house today, you need something with provenance. You need to know which hands it's passed through.
But any lucky finder in the US would face a catch-22. For a collector to be certain, for its identity to be official, the Honjo Masamune would have to be sent to Japan for shinsa, a rigorous examination by Japanese experts.
The problem with that is, if you live in America and you own this sword and you send it to Japan for shinsa, they won't allow it to be exported again. So you've actually got to give it back to Japan, basically, to get it verified.
So, if anyone did find it, they would have every incentive to keep it secret, for fear of losing it. Whatever the case, the whereabouts of the Honjo Masamune remains a complete mystery to this day. Anyone trying to trace it faces huge obstacles. The few clues there are sparse. The identity of the elusive cavalry sergeant is still a mystery. Precisely what happened that day at the Majiro police station may never be known. If only we had the paperwork, a signature, the Honjo Masamune might yet be found. It's one of the ironies of this story that the Honjo Masamune needn't have been handed in at all. If the Tokugawas had only waited just a few months until the law was changed, they could have kept it.
Maybe even 6 months later, it would have been protected. It would still be there. It would probably be somewhere deep in a vault in the Tokyo National Museum. The Honjo Masamune would have become, again, firmly, finally, a national treasure, a national property put on show for the people of the new nation, not as a weapon, as a work of art.
There is another irony. Because it is lost, the Honjo Masamune has been transformed from a historical artifact to a thing of legend.
Maybe the most important fact about this sword is that it's lost. A thing that no longer is there, or a thing that you've never seen, is much more powerful than one that you have close at hand.
The legend will only ever grow stronger until more evidence can establish where it is or whether it has been destroyed.
Unless we see its corpse or something, we'll never know, will we? I mean, unless we see its broken tang or something, we'll never know.
Anyone with a love of Japanese swords can never give up hope.
I still somehow feel that it still does exist, possibly unrecognised, somewhere.
Things usually turn up when somebody dies and heirs go in and discover objects. It could still turn up. If it did, it would be a media spectacle.
It would be wonderful if somebody could find that sword.
While a treasure such as the Honjo Masamune remains lost, stories will be told of its possible location, and people will dream of it, hunt for it. The lost sword of the samurai.
In Japan, there is a legend of a great buried treasure.
You would be talking about tens of millions of dollars worth of gold coins in today's money.
It is the supposed fortune of a mighty warlord, buried deep in the mountains.
It's in a bit of Japan that's pretty much ignored.
This warlord, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, was the last of his kind, the last shogun of Japan.
The shogunate stayed for 250 years, 15 generations.
The key to his riches lay with a faithful servant who carried his secret to the grave.
He was just rounded up suddenly and decapitated.
Two rival families are locked in a race to find this fabulous treasure.
It was such an important part of Japan's history. If only you could dig up some bit from the time.
Their quest would bridge generations, lasting more than a century, and capture the imagination of a country.
This just kind of fed into people's desire to believe in some kind of fantasy.
This is the story of an extraordinary treasure hunt, a bitter rivalry, and a fortune beyond imagination. The lost treasure of the last shogun. At the turn of the 21st century, an elderly man spent his last days digging deep in the mountains of central Japan. He was looking for gold.
Japan is very mountainous, so there's huge numbers of areas where potentially somebody could have gone and sequestered some stuff.
His name was Mizuno Tomoyuki. The fortune he sought was a treasure that was lost almost 140 years previously.
According to the most popular version of the legends, there were originally over 4 or 5 million coins total. So you would be talking about tens of millions of dollars worth of gold coins in today's money.
Mizuno Tomoyuki had spent his entire life on a quest for this vast hoard of coins and felt he was on the verge of an extraordinary breakthrough.
We, Mizuno, can dig for 3, 4, 5, even 100 generations, because warriors from the samurai days entrusted this to us. If we hadn't been entrusted with this, it would be just some treasure hunt, and I would have stopped long ago. I'm not that stupid.
Where did all this money come from, and why did it mysteriously vanish? The roots of the legend stretch back to a time of great upheaval. 1866. For 263 years, one family, the House of Tokugawa, held the reins of power. They seized the country in a violent insurrection, then brought centuries of peace to this wild land.
Historically, it's been very hard to hold the country together. It always falls apart. Civil wars repeatedly take place. If you imagine Switzerland, where you have mountain, valley, torrent, another mountain, another torrent, and imagine that continuing from Stockholm to Naples. That's what Japan is.
So far, there had been 15 generations of Tokugawa rulers, but they were not emperors. They were shoguns.
Shogun literally means barbarian subduing generalissimo. And it's a title that is given to someone officially by the emperor who lives in Kyoto.
The latest of this long line was Tokugawa Yoshinobu. In theory, he was a military commander who served at the emperor's pleasure. In practice, he ruled supreme, and all bowed to him. From his ancestral home at Edo Castle, the shogun governed with the aid of a vast aristocratic class, the samurai. It was an ancient feudal system that had endured for centuries.
The shogunal system was created early in the 17th century, and the first shogun was deified. That made it very difficult ever to change anything that he had set in place.
From his exalted position, the shogun not only held the reins of power, but wealth beyond imagination. At his court, a group of his most loyal and trusted samurai were given the task of administering his vast fortune. One of them was a man named Oguri Tadamasa.
Oguri Tadamasa is what's called a bannerman. He's one of about 5,000 mid-ranking samurai who are loyal to the Tokugawa shogunate and really function as mid-level bureaucrats in the regime.
He was well-educated bureaucrat, come from a decent family. When he was young, people very quickly realised he had both mastered the military skills but also kind of literature and poetry and things like that, which was what you needed in order to have legitimacy in the top levels of the Japanese bureaucracy.
Oguri reached an exalted position as the shogun's commissioner of finance. His role was to account for the huge sums paid to the shogun in taxation. Every warlord owed the shogun an annual tribute, and all that wealth passed through Oguri's hands.
Essentially, he was the accountant for the Tokugawa regime itself. And this was a very important position because the Tokugawa shogunate needed money not only to pay all of its samurai, but to manage any reforms that they wanted to pursue.
Oguri knew that reforms were badly needed. Life in Japan had barely changed in 200 years. Yet beyond her shores, the world was in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. Oguri was one of the few Japanese who had been abroad and seen the benefits this brought to Western nations. He developed grand plans to modernize his deeply traditional society.
Oguri was just stunned by how far behind Japan was in terms of modern infrastructure. He wanted to create a postal system, he wanted to create a shipyard to kind of imitate what the West had. So he was one of the most vocal supporters of westernization, if you will.
But the shogun was not interested in change. And while he continued to live in splendor, the rest of Japan struggled in dire poverty.
95% of people, they were living in little miserable huts in the countryside as they had done for 1,000 years. They never left their village. Life was hard and miserable and cold in winter and hot in summer, and they died young.
This imbalance bred a wave of resentment that slowly spread through the country. A group of disaffected warlords, banished to the farthest corners of Japan, began to plot against the shogun.
One starts to get already feelings that the shogunate's outlasted its usefulness, and there comes a movement to return power to the emperor.
The conspirators were deeply loyal to the 16-year-old Emperor Meiji. In 1868, they hatch a plot to restore him to power and grab the wealth of the shogun for themselves. Encouraged by his growing band of supporters, Meiji orders the shogun to resign and sends his troops to remove him. The response from the shogun is not what anyone expected.
When the shogunate collapses, it's actually quite startling. The shogun kind of like retires. He doesn't kill himself, he doesn't set the city on fire, he just goes off and lives in the country for the rest of his life.
The shogun was gone. Without their master's protection, all of the Tokugawa retainers were in great danger. None more so than Oguri Tadamasa, the man in charge of the shogun's treasury. Oguri knew that the Meiji forces would be coming for him. They desperately wanted the shogun's vast wealth, and he would be tortured and killed in their efforts to find it. So he too fled the castle. But far from saving his own life, Oguri put himself at even greater risk. His flight sparked a rumor that would make him imperial enemy number one.
When Oguri was moving out, he had a lot of luggage with him. Some of those boxes were coin boxes, of course. So people thought that there must be coins in there.
Oguri escaped just in time.
When the emperor's forces arrive in Edo Castle, they immediately go into the treasuries and find that there are no coins there at all.
The treasuries were empty. The vast wealth of the shogun had vanished.
The Meiji forces just can't believe that there's no money at all. Someone must have the money somewhere. In one of the famous stories, they ask one of the Tokugawa samurai, "Where's all the money?" He tells them, "I don't know, but you should ask Oguri, the commissioner of finance."
But where was Oguri? And where could he have hidden such a large cache of money?
It came to their attention that Oguri had disappeared. There were also some rumours at the time from witnesses who claimed to have seen a man getting off of a boat in Gunma Prefecture, laden, and going off and potentially hiding something.
Gunma Prefecture was Oguri's ancestral home. It was a wild region, about 100 miles inland from Edo.
Gunma is a fairly high area with many mountainous plateaus. It's wild, it's far from everywhere.
It's very rural. It's in a bit of Japan that's pretty much ignored.
In other words, it was the ideal location to conceal a fortune. Oguri was now hiding here, in a Buddhist temple on the slopes of a dormant volcano, Mount Akagi. The rumor that he had millions of coins in his possession made him a marked man. A matter of days after his arrival, people came to rob him.
a group of about 10 gangsters or so whip up a mob of up to 700 people, and they essentially send a messenger to Oguri telling him to hand over all of the money that he has. Oguri sends a messenger with about 50 coins and says, look, this is really all I have. They don't believe him, and this mob attacks the temple where Oguri is staying, and Oguri and his retainers rout the mob and kill many of the gangsters.
Oguri and a small band of servants survive this attack in a stunning display of martial skill. But it was a hollow victory. Emperor Meiji now saw him as a serious threat to the new regime. Anyone with so much might and so much money had to be eliminated.
Because Oguri demonstrated that he has some kind of military expertise, and he has retainers with him and also village men with him who know how to fight, it is thought by the Meiji forces that perhaps Oguri is plotting to launch a counterattack.
A detachment of the emperor's best samurai are sent to kill Oguri. He was declared an outlaw on the spot and summarily sentenced to death.
But because Oguri was just rounded up suddenly and accused of being a criminal, he was just decapitated.
The next day, Oguri's family and the last of his loyal followers are rounded up too. They are also executed. The only ones who knew the treasure's whereabouts were dead. Yet from the ashes of Oguri's household, the legend of the lost treasure of the last shogun was born. With the restoration of the emperor, Japan entered a brave new world.
After the Meiji Emperor took over, Japan changed dramatically, incredibly quickly. It was full-on modernization.
The feudal system was abolished. Old Edo was renamed Tokyo, and Japan leaped into the white heat of the Industrial Revolution. The world of the shogun was consigned to history.
When the Meiji regime came to power, they had to villainize the previous regime. So the Tokugawa was turned into a kind of dark, primitive, unprogressive, feudal time.
Within a few short years, Oguri Taramasa was all but forgotten. Though ironically his ideas about shipyards, postal systems, and other newfangled technology were adopted wholesale. But one man could not let go of the past. His name was Nakajima Kurando. He would be the first in a long line of treasure hunters.
Nakajima Kurando supposedly worked within the Commission of Finance as a very low-ranking bureaucrat.
This petty bureaucrat claimed he was a noble samurai and one of Oguri Taramasa's most loyal retainers. Somehow, he escaped death at the hands of the emperor's men, and he knew about the existence of the hidden gold. Sometime in the late 1870s, he began to search for it. He believed it was somewhere in the wild terrain of Mount Akagi, where his master Oguri had died several years earlier. He enlisted an American railway man, one of thousands of foreigners trying to make their fortune in the new Japan. The American had two things that Nakajima needed: money to fund an expedition, and dynamite to blast into the hard rock of the mountain.
Nakajima buys land and says to this American, "Here, I found this gold coin and there's more of it up there. You can go digging in there and find it."
The pair dug together for months. However, no gold was found. Believing he had been duped, the American sued Nakajima. and Nakajima was sentenced to 2 years in prison for fraud. After his release, this once proud samurai was destitute. He was left homeless on the streets of Tokyo and had to seek shelter with some old family friends, the Mizunos. During his stay in the Mizuno house, Nakajima quickly made an impression with several members of the family, especially Mrs. Mizuno and her oldest son, Tomoyoshi.
Mizuno Tomoyoshi was a young man. He remembers Nakajima essentially having an illicit relationship with his mother after his father died.
For some months, Nakajima continued as a live-in lover for Mrs. Mizuno. In that time, he also became an inspiration to her son. Tomoyoshi came to regard him as a stepfather. Yet despite their close relationship, Nakajima kept the legend of the gold a closely guarded secret. Then, without warning, Nakajima strangely vanished. Tomoyoshi took the disappearance particularly hard. He assumed he would never again hear from the man he once called his dad. He was wrong. A decade after he went missing, Nakajima Kurando broke his silence.
One day, after not seeing Nakajima for some 10 years, a letter suddenly arrives.
In the letter, Nakajima explains that he is dying. He begs Tomoyoshi's forgiveness and pleads for his adopted son to come to see him one last time. He had to tell Tomoyoshi a secret about the lost treasure of the last shogun.
So Mizuno Tomoyoshi visits Nakajima as he's sick and dying, and is essentially given a bunch of documents and told to go find the gold.
When they met, Nakajima revealed that in all his years away, he had been desperately searching for the hidden treasure. To Tomoyoshi's utter amazement, Nakajima asked him to continue the quest and gave him all of his research.
It doesn't have a map and it doesn't say the treasure is here, but it supposedly has all these puzzles that'll help him find the treasure.
Just days after this encounter, Nakajima died. Tomoyoshi was shocked at the secret life of his stepfather. To him, the whole idea of the quest seemed ludicrous. Mount Akagi is 6,000 feet high and covers hundreds of square miles. The gold could be anywhere, and Nakajima's documents offered no concrete information. But around the turn of the 20th century, his life took a dramatic turn.
It seems that the real tipping point for Mizuno was when his wife suddenly died of pneumonia.
In the wake of this devastating loss, Tomoyoshi fell back on the legacy of the lost treasure and threw himself into Nakajima's cryptic research.
He essentially has an emotional crisis, sells his business, sells his house, and moves out to Mount Akagi in Gunma Prefecture to begin buying land and looking for the treasure.
Tomoyoshi made a solemn vow to carry on Nakajima's quest for the lost treasure of the shogun. It wasn't long before he made a breakthrough in deciphering some of the arcane riddles, and that, in turn, led to his first real discovery.
He claims to have found a small gold statue. He also claims to have these copper plates that have markings on them and a little map.
Tomoyoshi's entire life was now dedicated to the search for gold.
He goes around and tells people that he has these things in order to get money to continue digging for the gold in Mount Akagi.
For almost 40 years, he dug and dug and dug. He even found a new wife who agreed to help him in his search and started a family, all the while with no job to speak of. Tomoyoshi burned through the savings he built up from his previous life.
When he starts off, he's rather wealthy. He was a real estate guy in Tokyo, and he had a lot of money with him when he first moved out there, but he gradually ran out of money.
The quest for the treasure bankrupted Tomoyoshi. But whatever troubles he had, he ignored them. He was obsessed with only one thing: finding the shogun's gold. Yet no matter how deep he went, no matter how carefully he scrutinized the clues in his growing pile of documents, he found nothing. In 1926, Mizuno Tomoyoshi died, heartbroken and penniless. Tomoyoshi's son, Mizuno Aizaburo, was a policeman who wanted nothing to do with buried treasure. But Aizaburo's mother was desperate to continue the search. She begged Aizaburo to carry on the family quest.
After Tomoyoshi dies, Tomoyoshi's wife tells her son, look, your father felt that you were the one who really should be digging for treasure. And so she gives Aizaburo all of the documents that Tomoyoshi had.
Aizaburo felt he had no choice but to honor his father's wishes. He quit his job and moved to Mount Akagi. The torch had passed to a new generation.
In a way, this tradition of treasure hunting has become associated with the Mizuno family, so they're the experts, and they have this lineage as well.
Aizaburo had inherited all of Nakajima Kurando's documents, and still more research that his father had done in 40 years of searching. Still, no gold had yet been found, and the vast bulk of Mount Akagi remained unexplored. Where to start?
He does continue, in some part, digging some of the tunnels that his father had started, but through his own research, he also starts digging other tunnels around Mount Akagi.
After just a few months of digging, some valuable new clues were uncovered.
And they do find this kind of stone tortoise with strange writing on it, and they see that as a sign that this is a clue that will lead us closer to the treasure.
Aizaburo's search continued into the 1930s, but as he dug on, Japan was changing around him. The country harbored vast imperial ambitions, and it was marching steadily towards war. At this time, there was a newfound interest in Oguri Tadamasa, the last shogun's most fervent modernizer, and the source of the shogun's treasure legend.
In the late 1920s and early 1930s, there's an Oguri boom. He really becomes a kind of national hero, a supporter of the Japanese Navy, and there are lots of books and biographies written about him.
One man decided to use Oguri's newly restored good name for his own ends, to seek out the shogun's missing fortune. He was called Kawahara Hidemori. Now the Mizunos had a rival, and the race to find the treasure was heating up.
Kawahara Hidemori decides to claim that he is the grandson of an illicit relationship between Oguri and some mistress.
As Oguri's illegitimate grandson, Kawahara believed only he had the right to search for the shogun's treasure. He had been researching likely burial sites for years. But before he could begin his dig, he needed to raise a substantial amount of money. In 1934, he launched a publicity drive. Taking advantage of the nationalist sentiment of the day, Kawahara arranged a press conference at the Buddhist temple where the severed head of Oguri Tadamasa was supposedly buried.
He becomes very popular in the 1930s among treasure hunters. He shows up with a kimono with the Oguri family crest on it and essentially says that he's here to, help find the treasure.
Before a small crowd at the temple, Kawahara promised to completely refurbish it in Oguri's memory and donate the rest of the money to the nation, minus his own cut for expenses, of course. But then the chief monk of the temple unexpectedly intervened. He had been watching Kawahara's performance and didn't believe a word. He stepped in front of the crowd himself to denounce Kawahara as a fraud. In the monk's opinion, Kawahara was definitely not Oguri's grandson, and Oguri himself would not have approved of this whole charade. Still, many members of the Japanese public bought into his story and gave money. Kawahara also attracted one major sponsor, a shady pachinko gambling boss. Awash with money, Kawahara began his own dig for the treasure. Unlike the Mizuno family, he claimed the gold was not on Mount Akagi, but in a small village to the southwest of Tokyo. Like his rivals, Kawahara dug for many fruitless years. Nothing stopped his relentless quest or the flow of money from well-wishers. Not even the Second World War. Indeed, his promise to donate any gold he found to the Japanese nation was a source of hope in those turbulent years.
Throughout the war and even into the 1950s, Kawahara continues to dig in all sorts of places south of Tokyo and earns a lot of money from people who he convinces that this story is true.
By the early 1960s, Kawahara had been searching for almost 30 years. Now Japan was undergoing a massive economic revival, and Kawahara's gambling boss patron was a rich man. His change in fortunes helped take the expedition to a new level.
In this period, Japan performs an economic miracle. It's absolutely incredible. And the middle class expands, and everybody seems to be doing incredibly well out of this economic nationalism.
Unlike the Mizunos, struggling in poverty, Kawahara could afford to delve far underground. He dug a deep mine with an electric lift and the latest groundwater pumps to keep the site dry. He also had 13 workers to help him excavate. With these new resources, he raced ahead in the contest to uncover the gold. He dug down 250 feet to the supposed location of the great chests of coins. But, despite his well-financed operation, Kawahara Hidemori, the alleged illegitimate grandson of Oguri, was unable to find any treasure. In 1967, he died, but still, the legend of the treasure lived on.
People were aware of this idea of the Tokugawa treasure. In the 1970s, the Yomiuri newspaper ran a massive series on this idea of hidden treasure. Every single article said, well, this is the legend and nothing's been found. This is the legend, but nothing's been found. These people were searching and they didn't find anything. But this went on and on and on for 16 separate articles.
Rumors of buried treasure rumbled on for decades after Kawahara's death, and the legend became part of Japanese popular culture. But it was not until the 1990s that another serious effort was made to find it. This time, it was the Mizunos, the rival treasure-hunting family, that would come closer than ever to unlocking the mystery of the shogun's lost fortune. 2 generations of the family, Tomoyoshi and his son Aizaburo, had been digging on the slopes of Mount Akagi for nearly a century. Now a 3rd generation of Mizuno treasure hunters was about to enter the game. Mizuno Tomoyuki, the son of Aizaburo. Like his father and his grandfather before him, he was highly skeptical of the legend.
Initially, he did not want any part of the treasure hunting. He thought it was a total sham. He didn't believe that the Tokugawa shogunate would have buried gold coins, and basically he went off on his own in Tokyo and worked in a variety of jobs.
But Tomoyuki could not resist the pull of the quest that his family had been pursuing since the late 19th century. It was not simply a question of finding the money. It was a matter of family honor.
There's the weight of carrying on the family tradition, which is established in Japanese culture and history and society. This idea of you trying very, very hard until the end, this idea of ganbaru, which means to work hard. You will persevere through whatever comes along, and you will ultimately succeed in the end. This is very much instilled in people in Japan at a very, very early age.
Tomoyuki decided that he must follow in the footsteps of his forebears and give up his day job in Tokyo. He swore to dedicate his life to the completion of this epic quest.
Was just attracted by the legacy of his father and his grandfather. And he also became convinced, because of all these old documents that his grandfather had from the 19th century. So he began doing research on his own and began digging a whole separate series of tunnels separate from his father and grandfather.
Tomoyuki's quest coincided with a new time of upheaval in Japan. The economy had collapsed, and a national mood of depression set in. The Japanese media began casting around for a hero.
The 1990s is called the lost decade.
Japan's lost decade is about economic stagnation. One should remember that that stagnation came after a protracted period of enormous growth, which could not have been maintained forever.
Not only was there economic crisis, but there was political scandal, a natural disaster, a terrorist attack in Tokyo. And this just kind of fed into people's desire to believe in some kind of fantasy.
And what better fantasy than the legendary lost treasure of the shogun? One enterprising television network called Mizuno Tomoyuki to see if he wanted to be on TV.
In the early 1990s, there was a Japanese entertainment show appropriately called Gimme a Break.
It follows a pattern of Japanese television shows that you still get today. It'll have a number of celebrities interviewing other celebrities, music, animation, sketches, all put together in a 2-hour format.
A Japanese copywriter who grew up in Gunma was familiar with the legend, and he decided to produce a show about the treasure hunting in Mount Akagi.
In their call to Tomoyuki, the producers explained they wanted to cast him and his family as modern-day heroes, men determined to succeed in the face of insurmountable odds. Men who embodied the noble idea of ganbaru.
It's entirely sensible for them to get in contact with the Mizunos and try and use their expertise, but also to legitimize what they're doing. They're not just rushing off into Gunma Prefecture with a load of cranes and digging holes. They've got the guy, and he's the person who's going to make sure we do this properly.
It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. The producers of Gimme a Break got a never-ending real-life soap opera to inspire the nation. In return, Tomoyuki received more resources than he could ever dream of. After years in the wilderness, the Mizunos were back, with the best chance they would ever have of striking gold.
The Mizuno, they've been searching for 120 years and haven't found anything. If a TV producer says to you, we're going to give you 12 cranes and loads of digging equipment, would you like to get on board? I mean, for him, this is a huge boon, because he doesn't have to do it on his own.
The whole nation seemed to be willing Tomoyuki on, and with his help, the TV company found gold, ratings gold.
There would be these huge backhoes and cranes that would dig this enormous pit, almost the size of a rock quarry. And they would find these horizontal tunnels, and so they would go digging in there, and then some earth would fall in a funny way, and they would say, aha, someone must have buried something there. They would find a few bottles, which was an indication that perhaps Oguri's French connections had wine out here and dropped a bottle long ago.
Altogether, the network revisited the Mount Akagi treasure site 10 times in the 1990s, each time with a more elaborate and expensive effort to find the hidden treasure.
When they find lots and lots of tunnels, what they're finding are the tunnels that were dug in the 1930s in order to find the treasure. But that is conveniently left out of the story because it's not very exciting.
This was no longer about logic, it was about magic. Fueled by growing viewer numbers, the search soon became completely detached from reality.
When more money started coming in to produce the show, they hired a few American psychics to come over. They flew over Mount Akagi in a helicopter to try to feel the psychic power of where the treasure would be buried. They also hired an esoteric Buddhist monk to pray to the ancestors to find where the treasure was. And each episode ended with a cliffhanger that, something had just been found, so that would get people to watch the next time.
In the final installment, in 1999, the dig reached fever pitch. By now, the Mizuno excavation works resembled something like an open-cast mine. It descended fully 200 feet below the surface of the mountain. A network of tunnels, dug over generations by the Mizunos, went down even further still. In one final dramatic push, a huge industrial mining drill was brought in to dig still further, hoping to find a hidden cavern containing the gold. But the media frenzy had overwhelmed Tomoyuki. He came to believe the TV company did not care about the treasure itself. All they wanted was a grand spectacle to please their audience.
It seems that in the later episodes, Mizuno felt that they were going on the wrong track. And he almost felt that there was a rivalry between this team and his own search. And he eventually dropped out of the project altogether.
The TV audience soon began to dwindle, and the show was eventually cancelled. Tomoyuki was alone once more, and still, he pressed on with his dig.
There was always some aspect, something that made them feel like we're almost 90% there. And so he couldn't give up.
Meanwhile, the Mizuno's rivals for the treasure, the Kawahara family, had been laboring away 140 miles to the south, largely under the radar since the death of Kawahara Hidemori in 1967. The quest to find the lost treasure had passed from old Hidemori to his son, Kawahara Jiro. In his early digs, Jiro made a number of discoveries, which he claimed were clear evidence that the gold itself was only a few meters further down.
He claims to have found little objects here and there, and those objects he gives as proof that he's closer to the treasure legend, and of course that makes it easier for him to convince people to give him money.
Among the objects he found were human bones and other Tokugawa-era artifacts, pointing towards the treasure's location. In the year 2000, Jiro took a leaf from his father's book and launched a publicity drive. Just like his father, the thing he wanted was money. The press descended on the same location where his father had appeared almost 70 years before. There, they witnessed Kawahara unveiling a bronze sword and a golden coin, dating from the time of the Tokugawa shogunate. But however much Jiro insisted his artifacts were genuine, the public was now quite skeptical of the whole story.
When experts look at the objects, they find out that essentially these are objects that he bought at a local antique store.
Jiro's claim to be on the verge of finding the treasure was widely denounced, and he seemed to have little hard evidence to back his story up. The Kawahara family's hunt for the treasure was over. The latest generation, Jiro's son, has abandoned the quest completely.
The youngest member of the family wants absolutely nothing to do with his father's search for buried treasure and is actually quite embarrassed by it.
But what of Mizuno Tomoyuki, the unlikely star of Gimme a Break? In 2006, another filmmaker caught up with him. These are some of the extraordinary images he captured. Now a wizened old man dying of cancer, the proud treasure hunter felt he had been cursed by 2 generations of his family. He could not give up his quest, ever.
But that's the star I've been born under with this family. I have this sense of responsibility that I have to do this. That's why I do it. Is there anyone else who has this kind of responsibility? If so, I'd like to meet them. Is there anyone else in Japan who has been entrusted by the samurai of the past?
Someone asked him once, what would you do if you found the treasure? And he said, I would kick it really hard because my family struggled and lost a lot of money and energy in finding this. But he just felt that it was his destiny, his fate, to find this treasure. A fate that no one else but he and his family would be able to fulfill.
After almost 140 years of searching, no one has yet found any gold. So does the treasure really exist? Or was the legend just that?
There has been a lot of stories about the shogunate, the kind of shogunate that wouldn't die. It was such an important part of Japan's history. There's a kind of romantic feeling we don't want it to go away. Only you could dig up some bit from the time.
Despite all of the research done down the years by the Mizuno family, a more objective examination of the facts show that, in all likelihood, there was no money buried in the first place.
There's absolutely no evidence and no possibility that there was buried treasure anywhere.
This is because, in Japan, during the shogunate, gold coins were not used as a measure of wealth.
It's a sort of a Western notion that you have a kind of a jewel tower in which you put all these rich things, and as long as they're in there, you're rich. But for Japan, you're simply having gold sitting in a tower was not of a great deal of use to anyone.
Instead, the great lords of the era counted their riches using a different material: rice.
The standard unit of exchange was rice. And rice is a wonderful unit of exchange because if you get hungry, you can eat it, but also it can be broken up into any sizes. Also, it lasts for quite a long time. And the principal unit of rice was what they call a koku. And a koku, it's enough to sustain an adult for a year.
A junior samurai might earn 100 koku a year. The higher up the social scale he was, the more koku he would be entitled to as tribute from the farmers on his land. The leading lords, such as the shogun himself, would have each claimed more than 1 million koku annually. In fact, the entire class structure of Japan during the shogunate was built around the growing and storage of rice. This was helpful for feeding armies. But when it came to acquiring desirable goods like silk, pottery, or weapons, rice was useless.
The samurai class are paid in rice yield. The merchants operate in coin. You can't buy things with rice, so that the merchants change rice into coin, and they take a rake off, and over time, the amount of coin you get for your rice goes down. The samurai class are increasingly impoverished.
In time, even the shogun himself found his vast stockpiles of rice were worth barely a handful of gold coins. So when the revolution came, he could not afford to defend himself.
One of the reasons why the Tokugawa regime falls is because it doesn't have cash to pay its allies for continued military support. If they had any money at all, the Tokugawa shogunate would have been using it to fund their defense against their warlords.
So the question then remains, if there was no gold, why would anyone spend so much time and effort to try and find a treasure that never really existed?
I think they really believed in this legacy. Especially Mizuno Tomoyuki felt that this was just the destiny of his family, that there was too much in terms of 100-year-old documents to really just give it up.
Regardless of how much Mizuno Tomoyuki believed in the legend, he could not convince his children that the gold really existed. He would be the last in his family's long line of treasure hunters.
He has 3 adult children. None of them have expressed any interest at all in continuing this Mizuno family legacy of searching for the treasure.
Tomoyuki was utterly alone in his quest. But even though he had no one to help him, he continued to dig until his very last days. In 2010, Mizuno Tomoyuki died. The search for the lost treasure of the last shogun died with him. Yamashita's gold is one of the greatest treasure hoards ever known.
In today's currency, it represents over $100 billion in value.
According to the myth, this incredible fortune was the proceeds of ruthless Japanese looting throughout Asia during World War II. For one amateur treasure hunter, finding the gold became a lifelong obsession.
If he had to get down on his hands and knees and dig with his fingers until they bled, I see him being that kind of man.
But little did he know, he had a mighty rival, one of the most brutal dictators of the 20th century.
Marcos was unquestionably a thug. He was a gangster.
Just when this penniless Filipino had riches beyond his wildest dreams within his grasp, his quest turned into a nightmare.
He's put a target on his back.
This is the extraordinary story of Roger Rojas.
He was willing to be David against Goliath.
Roger was a hero.
And the legend of Yamashita's gold. In May 1970, amateur treasure hunter Roger Rojas was combing the jungles around his hometown of Baguio in the northern Philippines. For over a decade, he'd spent every spare moment searching for a long-lost hoard of treasure. He'd put all his money into his quest. Unless he found it, he faced ruin. Then, after weeks of backbreaking work, at last, Roger spotted something. Had he finally found what he'd been looking for his entire life? Had he found Yamashita's gold? The legend of Yamashita's gold is one of the greatest stories of war loot in history. By 1942, the Japanese Imperial Army had successfully invaded all of Southeast Asia. As they advanced, they mercilessly ransacked country after country. They stole on a massive scale, reportedly unrivaled in military history.
Yamashita's gold is wealth beyond belief. People wouldn't believe how much it is. $1 trillion worth. So it's a mind-blowing amount.
The mastermind heading this covert operation, codenamed the Golden Lily, was said to be Prince Chichibu, the emperor's brother.
This guy is brilliant. Prince Chichibu was a perfect choice to head up the Golden Lily because he wasn't just a military man, he was an Oxford scholar, and he brought an incredible amount of creativity and lateral thinking to how we'll go about this complex process of looting.
The Golden Lily operatives just completely took everything from all the countries. They left them with nothing. They invaded, they took all their wealth, and just left them penniless.
It wasn't just banks and financial institutions, but it also had museums, temples, art galleries, rare books, anything that was worth money. They knew about it, knew where it was, how much it was worth, and they took it. The Golden Lily's looting was so comprehensive, they even targeted the underworld, the gangster world, the black markets, and they absolutely drained them of anything that was of value.
Having amassed treasures of all shapes and sizes, the Golden Lily's mission was far from over. They needed to get it back home, to Japan. First, they melted the gold into easy-to-move ingots. But this smelting also served a shadier purpose.
When gold is made, it's stamped, and you can tell where it came from. But when it's been resmelted, you don't know where it came from. So he wanted to stamp the little sign on the gold bars that the gold was actually made in Japan. Then it would look like the gold was Japanese gold of Japanese origin.
This stolen gold was then brought to the Philippines. There it was inventoried and then sent on to Japan by ship.
The Philippines was chosen as the Golden Lily's transportation hub because it was pretty much in the center of the vast Japanese empire.
For the first year of operations, the Golden Lily's transportation network ran like clockwork. But then, the tide of the war turned. In June 1942, Japanese and US forces met near the tiny Pacific island of Midway. Over just 4 days, the US forces sank 5 Japanese ships. They destroyed 270 aircraft and killed 3,500 men. The Japanese had lost control of the seas. Now it was too risky for them to ship the gold home. They needed a new plan. They turned to their finest fighting general, Tomoyuki Yamashita.
He has an incredible track record. Nobody has the reputation he does, and if anyone can pull one out of the hat, it would be him.
Yamashita made his name when he caused the greatest humiliation of the British Army in its history. In December 1941, he invaded Malaya, sweeping down the peninsula in only a matter of weeks. Yamashita then captured the British military stronghold of Singapore.
Hitherto, both Malaya and Singapore had been thought to be completely unassailable, that the British were totally in charge militarily, and he proved them wrong. He made the British capitulate, and it was the biggest capitulation of the British Army in British military history.
Virtually overnight, Yamashita took nearly 100,000 Allied soldiers prisoner. His victory sent shockwaves across the world and earned Yamashita his fearsome nickname, the Tiger of Malaya. With the gold now stuck in the Philippines, Yamashita was being asked to come up with another miracle. The story goes, he was told to hide the gold until it was safe to move it. He identified 175 suitable burial sites across the Philippines. They would hold the gold until the Japanese were once again victorious. And the Philippines proved the ideal place to hide this treasure.
They put it in very isolated parts throughout the Philippines, mostly covered by very mountainous terrain and a thick, thick jungle. Once you got these tunnels built, it would become virtually impossible to see that there had been anything ever buried there because of the growth rate in the jungle.
It said Yamashita ordered detailed maps to be made of the exact location of each treasure vault. And each map was carefully encoded.
These maps were done in an old Japanese dialect called kanji, a language which is between 1,500 and 2,000 years old, and there were no topographical references on them. They used the old characters to represent certain landmarks.
Unless you knew the complex code, these maps were meaningless. And there were even further layers of security.
Bombs, grenades, decoy walls that would lead you into another trap.
The Golden Lily left nothing to chance, and they had a vast system of booby traps that consisted of poisonous gas, explosives, complex use of the water table, so if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to drown in your pursuit of reaching the treasures.
But the maps that were drawn highlighted where all those traps were. If you didn't have a map and you went into one of these treasure vaults, it's very likely that you wouldn't come out alive.
And to ensure all the treasure vault locations remained top secret, the number of people in the know was ruthlessly kept to a minimum.
They used prisoner of war or local slave labor to build the actual treasure vaults. And the people who are building it don't know why, but that's irrelevant. They're gonna die anyway. So they're usually killed, shot on the spot.
But for all Yamashita's efforts, the gold still wasn't safe. In October 1944, the Americans landed in the Philippines. The fighting that followed was the bloodiest of the Pacific War.
The fighting in the Philippines at the end of the war was extremely brutal.
Yamashita would fight to the very last man for the emperor.
But even a master tactician like Yamashita couldn't stop the Americans' advance.
The Philippines has 7,000 plus islands and is very, very difficult to defend against an invading force. Yamashita, as a great general, would have known that.
Yamashita faced a crisis. He knew he couldn't hold the Philippines. All he could do was drag out the fight for as long as possible. And it seemed there was one particular reason Yamashita needed to buy himself time. He still hadn't finished burying the gold.
Gold and Lily are running out of time and desperate. So they've got these ships in the harbor with gold that they need to get into the tunnels. They have no time. What do? They scuttle them and sink them.
April 1945. Yamashita had been forced to retreat back to the mountains around the northern city of Baguio.
Their systematic hiding of their national treasure becomes less systematic and more panicked. They need to do it immediately because they're about to suffer defeat. 174 treasure vaults done and dusted. Only one is left.
With time running out, Yamashita ordered the chief engineers to seal the final treasure vault.
These engineers knew everything. They knew how the maps were made. They knew where the burial sites were. They knew how they were booby-trapped.
What they didn't know was Yamashita had one last move to protect the gold. The story goes that while the engineers were carrying out his orders, Yamashita sealed the vault himself. The engineers were still inside. Now, they would be its guardians for eternity. Three months later, World War II was over. General Yamashita was put on trial for war crimes.
Did you at any time issue any orders directing the killing of non-combatant citizens?
Absolutely not. Anything.
The trial lasted just over 5 weeks.
The commission finds you guilty as charged and sentences you to death by hanging.
Yamashita took the secrets of the gold to his grave. There was only one other person who allegedly knew of the gold's whereabouts: Prince Chichibu. And in 1953, he died of TB.
Anybody who knew anything about this treasure is now dead.
It seemed Yamashita's gold was lost forever. But in the Philippines, after the horrors of war, the legend of Yamashita's gold lived on.
There were lots and lots of rumors that the Japanese had buried treasure all over the Philippines.
It's almost a national obsession. Everybody across the country is aware of it, and everyone's looking for it.
Among those who'd grown up with stories about the gold was a young Filipino locksmith. Rogelio Rojas, better known as Roger, was born in 1943, just as Yamashita's gold was being buried.
Roger's childhood was really difficult. The Philippines are extremely impoverished. His family is impoverished.
Roger was one of millions of Filipinos growing up in the shadow of World War II.
The war had devastated the Philippines. Manila was absolutely on its knees in a way that no other city in the whole of the Second World War, other than Warsaw. It was dreadful. Hundreds of thousands killed, families broken up, desperate poverty, no real economy going. It was in a really bad state.
So it was no surprise that the legend of Yamashita's gold just took Roger by by heart at a very young age, someone that poor with a possibility of obtaining wealth beyond your wildest dreams, of course you're going to go for it.
Roger the locksmith lived in Baguio, the northern city, near to where Yamashita made his last stand.
Roger surmises that they must have hid some of the treasure around his town. So he looks around his town right from the start, because he knows logically that's probably one of the best places to start.
Roger was a very diligent man. Every spare moment he was out there working, seeing what he could find, eliminating areas, and continuing to move forward in a very logical, progressive manner.
To help him in his quest, Roger scrimped and saved and bought himself a metal detector. Yet all Roger had ever managed to find were a few old coins and some Japanese ammunition. But that didn't shake his faith. One day he was sure he would come across the treasure he'd been dreaming of since he was a boy.
No matter how many disappointments a treasure hunter has, they will always keep going.
Then, in 1961, after years of hunting the gold with just youthful optimism, Roger had what seemed to be a breakthrough. He got the kind of clue he'd been longing for, a map of a tunnel complex. There were lots of maps and sketches like this in treasure hunting circles at the time. Roger had seen plenty of them before, but all had been fakes. This one was different. This map had come from a Japanese soldier.
He's convinced that this is the real deal.
Trouble was, the map was in the Golden Lily's fiendishly complex code.
It's a needle in a haystack, and you don't even know where the haystack is because the map has no topographical features.
But Roger also knew that this Japanese soldier had been in Baguio with a group of engineers as they buried gold during the final days of Yamashita's retreat. The map allegedly related to one of those treasure vaults.
It was getting closer. He could feel it.
Roger never gives up. And the reason is he knows the treasure is there. And he knows that year after year, if nothing else, he's eliminating where it isn't.
Yet for all his high hopes, Roger just couldn't crack the map's code. And so, even after looking for several more years, he was still no closer to finding Yamashita's gold. But at least the map confirmed to Roger his first instincts were right. There had to be treasure somewhere around Baguio.
He knows it's there. This is not a myth. This is historical fact.
Then Roger met a man who seemed to offer him his next breakthrough, Eusebio Okubo. Okubo told Roger he had served under the Japanese as an interpreter during their occupation of the Philippines.
There were a lot of Filipinos who claimed to know where Japanese buried treasure was, mainly because an awful lot of Filipinos had, perforce, worked with the Japanese, not necessarily what we would call collaborators, but simply because the Japanese needed cooks, drivers, interpreters, all that sort of thing.
When Roger met Okubo, he would have had mixed feelings. Here's somebody who colluded with the enemy.
Okubo confessed he had served none other than General Yamashita. While working for him, Okubo had witnessed Yamashita taking a large quantity of gold to Baguio towards the very end of the war. And then, Okubo revealed the crucial piece of information Roger was after. This gold was in wooden boxes, stashed in a tunnel not far from Baguio General Hospital.
So this was the final link. This allowed him to tie the bow together and have the perfect package. Now he knows where to go, he knows where to dig. He was elated because it now pinpointed the area for him to look at.
But little did Roger know, he had a rival. The most powerful man in the Philippines, President Ferdinand Marcos. In 1965, Marcos had been democratically elected. But he rapidly became a pathologically greedy dictator.
Money was extremely important to Ferdinand Marcos. He loved it like nothing else.
And there was only one person who could match Marcos's greed. His shopaholic wife, Imelda.
Marcos wooed Imelda, it is said, by taking her down to the vault beneath his bank and just showing her enormous great stacks of $100 bills. Whether or not this is true or not, I don't know, but it's extremely likely. And I should think it almost certainly would have convinced her that she was onto a good thing.
But Imelda's lavish lifestyle wasn't the only reason Marcos needed money.
The richer you were, the more powerful you were. It's that simple. It's a very simple equation.
And nothing could make Marcos more powerful than finding Yamashita's gold.
It's not at all surprising that Marcos was interested in Yamashita's gold because he was a thug, basically, and the mere thought of the promise of gold, and he would have been onto it like a shot.
Compared to Roger, Marcos had a serious advantage in the hunt for Yamashita's gold: power.
It was incredibly easy for Marcos to use his power to find the gold. He has entire armies at his disposal. Armies, ships, experts on maps and deciphering all sorts of clues.
Despite all these resources, Marcos hadn't found anything. And so he devised a shrewd strategy.
He was a brilliant politician, but he was also brilliantly corrupt. On the surface, he seemed to be a rational person, going by the law, by the books, but in person, he was quite ruthless.
Marcos passed a law demanding treasure hunters apply for a permit, detailing where they were going to start digging.
He comes up with the permit system because this way he has all the enthusiastic treasure hunters all across the country working for him because they've now told him where they think the treasure is.
He's just waiting to see if anyone finds it, then he can move in because he has the resources to do that. And you know, that's very smart.
Meanwhile, back in Baguio, in 1970, Roger married. With a new wife and child on the way, he needed Yamashita's gold now more than ever. And so Roger dutifully applied for one of Marcos's permits.
Roger did everything the right way. He thought that if he followed the rules that had been put in place by the government, he would be able to search, he would be able to find and excavate and recover, and it would all be done with the blessings of the government.
In Roger's town, the person who manages the application is none other than Marcos's uncle.
In May 1970, armed with his permit, his map, and Akubo's information, Roger decided to risk everything to find Yamashita's gold. He spent all his life savings hiring a team of laborers. Together they started hacking their way through the thick jungle vegetation near Baguio General Hospital.
So it was really difficult for Roger to find the tunnel near the hospital because it was 25 years before that it was blasted shut. And every single year in the rainy season, these jungles, you know, they change their look and feel dramatically.
Then, after 2 weeks of almost non-stop searching, Roger spotted the mouth of a cave. Could this be the entrance to the treasure vault Okubo told him about? A 100 meters into the tunnel, a collapse meant Roger couldn't go any further. But for Roger, this was a good sign. He knew the Japanese had used dynamite to blast their treasure vaults shut. And so Roger and his crew began the arduous task of clearing the way.
The conditions for Roger and the team digging the tunnel would have been horrific. It was hot, there were insects, there were snakes. It was very, very hard work.
Digging the tunnel was very, very dangerous. And Roger knew that if this really was a tunnel that the Japanese had built, there may be booby traps.
But Roger was willing to risk his life to get to Yamashita's gold.
Once you get that gold fever, it is insatiable. You just cannot quench that appetite. He was becoming obsessed. One more spade, one more rock. I'm going to get it. This is going to be the treasure of a lifetime. And everybody's going to say, yes, you found it.
Finally, after 4 long months of digging, they broke through. It was then he made a grim discovery. Skeletons dressed in rags. But these weren't just any rags. They were Japanese military uniforms. Surely these were the remains of the engineers who had hidden Yamashita's gold, only to be buried alive by Yamashita himself.
He thinks he's there, and he knows now that he has all the pieces to the puzzle. He is literally at the threshold of the gold recovery that he has sought now for 10 years. It's there, it's within his fingertips' grasp.
Stretching beyond the skeletons was a vast network of tunnels. Roger and his team spent weeks exploring them. Day after day, they found nothing.
The next day, he was out there ready to go again. He knew it was there. He believed in his heart of hearts that that gold was there. He was going to go after it no matter what.
But a full 6 months on from finding the entrance to the tunnel, Roger still hadn't found any treasure.
Roger had spent all the money that he had raised to start the dig to begin with, and no one was going to give him any more money.
No money meant no crew. It seemed the hunt was over. Roger had squandered his life savings on a huge mistake. Just before Roger decided to give up once and for all, he had one last go with his metal detector. Then he heard its telltale buzz.
This buzz that Roger got from his metal detector must have been the best sound he'd ever heard in his life.
Roger was stunned. Hiding behind the wall was a gold statue of Buddha.
This was that moment in life that you would look back on and you say, yes, I have achieved my goal for my entire life. This is it. This find is the most significant find of anything that anybody had discovered in the Philippines.
The Buddha was in the Burmese style. According to the legend, the Japanese had looted religious artifacts from temples right across Burma. He really must have found one of Yamashita's 175 treasure vaults. And that wasn't all. The area around the Buddha was stacked full of wooden boxes. Finally, it was payday.
The gold that Roger has just discovered is worth a fortune. Each of those bars is worth $1,000, and he estimated there were over 1,000 boxes of the gold bars. So you're talking an incredible amount of money, more treasure than even he ever dreamed he would find. I mean, this has surpassed his wildest expectations.
Roger returned home with the Buddha, planning to go back for the gold with trucks and men. But the more he looked at the statue, the more curious Roger became. There was something about it that wasn't quite right. The Buddha was full of diamonds.
The value had just gone off the chart.
Roger, I mean, he's getting richer and richer by the minute. He has 1,000 boxes of gold bars, he has a gold Buddha, and now he has handfuls of diamonds.
That night, Roger documented his life-changing find. News of Roger's miraculous discovery soon spread to the presidential palace.
I can just imagine him going crazy when the word had gotten to him. Marcos was going to do anything to get that Buddha away from Rojas, and it was going to eventually sit in Marcos' palace.
Unfortunately for Roger, Marcos's primary tactic was brute force. On the 5th of April 1971, it's said a group of mysterious men turned up at Roger's house.
Rojas didn't answer the door.
You have to ask yourself, how would you feel if all of a sudden at 2:30 in the morning, there's loud banging and knocking on the door? I think he'd be panic-stricken, and I'm sure he was.
They said, you have 3 minutes to open the door or we're going to shoot you right here. They took everything away from him.
Can you imagine the feeling of violation? His entire life, he's looked for this, he's found it, and now it's been taken.
But if Marcos thought he could intimidate Roger and his family, he was wrong.
Roger had risked everything to find this gold, and he wasn't going to let it go so easily.
Roger reported the theft to the police.
By that time, President Marcos had a considerable stranglehold on the police and the army particularly.
But Marcos did not yet control the media. Within days, the press picked up Roger's story.
It was a huge scandal. You know, there's stolen loot, it's World War II, it's the Japanese, it's Marcos being implicated.
The newspaper was full of articles that were nothing short of calling Marcos a common thief.
The hostile press coverage came at a critical time for Marcos.
He was widely known to have fixed his second term of office, the elections, which were ludicrously corrupt. I mean, he allegedly won by 2 million votes. It was just impossible. He was widely lampooned on all sides for corruption, and he was beginning to feel himself quite insecure.
Marcos needed to silence this treasure hunter fast. There was one obvious solution.
The Marcos regime was notorious for extrajudicial executions. You'd have death squads basically killing people who were seen as being very critical of the regime.
But this time Marcos needed a different approach.
I think by that time he must have thought that the story had enough public exposure for him not to be able to risk just making Roger vanish, like a lot of his opponents.
3 weeks later, Roger at last received some good news. He was told his Buddha was waiting to be collected at the courthouse in Baguio. When he got there, he was in for a shock.
When Roger saw the Buddha, he knew immediately this wasn't the Buddha that he'd found. It was a different color, different shape, facial expression. The head didn't come off.
Marcos is expecting Roger to say, yes, that's the Buddha, thank you.
But he didn't know Rojas. Rojas was determined. He wasn't going to let that boot up. And this was a huge mistake for Marcos because he had misread Rojas' personality.
Roger declared the Buddha was a fake.
I think that was completely reckless of him, because by that time he would have known that he was a marked man, and to cause that kind of fuss, effectively tackling Marcos himself at a personal level, would have been absolutely ridiculous and very stupid, in my view. However, he did it. He clearly was a very stubborn man.
Now he's publicly given him 2 fingers. Really, this marks the beginning of the end for Roger.
Just over 2 weeks later, more mysterious men came for Roger. And it seems it wasn't long before interrogation turned to torture. Over several days, Roger said he was repeatedly burned with cigarettes. He was beaten. And electrocuted. Eventually, Roger claimed he signed an affidavit stating Marcos had nothing to do with the theft of his Buddha, and revealed the location of the thousands of gold ingots.
Roger was a very broken man when he signed that affidavit. I mean, there he was fighting publicly, but now admitting that no, there was no wrongdoing. He must have been completely demoralized.
Marcos had Roger imprisoned and wasted no time helping himself to the rest of Roger's find. But eventually Marcos's megalomania would prove his undoing. In 1986, a popular revolution forced Marcos and Imelda to flee the country. The Filipino people stormed Marcos's presidential palace, and what they found inside was unbelievable.
They were amazed at what they found. They found treasures of statues and art and thousands of pairs of shoes. This is just what they left behind.
Marcos was by far and away the wealthiest man alive.
They were so wealthy, they didn't really know what to do with their money.
One of the questions for the Filipino people was, where had the Marcoses' enormous wealth come from? For most, there was an obvious answer.
Marcos's wealth primarily came from theft, embezzlement, and corruption. And you can look back, I think, on their joint reign as simply being a plot of self-enrichment. And the administration of the Philippines was merely a secondary item.
They were basically using the public treasury as their piggy bank.
Years later, while on trial for fraud and embezzlement, Imelda Marcos's defense declared their fortune was not looted from the Philippine treasury, but actually came from finding Yamashita's gold.
I think Imelda claimed that their joint wealth came primarily from finding Yamashita's gold because it was a very good blind. Nobody could prove otherwise. Yamashita's gold was just a wonderful alibi.
But for Roger Rojas, none of this mattered. His life was in ruins.
Roger never fully recovered from his torture. And the damage is so great that he can't see out of his right eye for the rest of his life after this. He's lost his money, he's lost his self-respect, he's lost his wife. Roger has lost everything.
Despite all this, Roger still had a bit of the spirit that had helped him find the gold.
It's a treasure hunter's mentality. They must get to the end of the story. They must get the treasure. Anyway, Roger had lost so much, he had nothing to lose.
With Marcos in exile in Hawaii, Roger filed a lawsuit against him. Even when Marcos died 1 year later, in September 1989, the case continued.
You could say that the Marcoses actually got away with it. He went out, lived his exile in Hawaii, and died of natural causes. You could well say that they did rather well out of it.
It would take a further 7 years before Roger was at last vindicated. In 1996, the jury concluded Marcos had stolen Roger's find. $43 billion in damages were awarded.
When the court finds in Roger's favor, it's a significant moment in legal history. $43 billion is awarded to Roger, which is the biggest civil lawsuit award in history.
Sadly, Roger never saw justice done. On the eve of his day in court, he died. He was just 49 years old. Then, in 1998, the huge compensation award was overturned. While no court has challenged the verdict that Marcos stole Roger's treasure, how to determine its value is still being fought out by the lawyers.
It's hard not to look back at Roger and feel empathy for this man. His determination was boundless. And I think, if nothing else, Roger was a hero. And I think that's how he's going to be remembered.
He was willing to be David against Goliath. He was willing to put his life on the line, and therefore my hat off to him.
Roger's tragic story begs the question, was what he found a one-off? Or as the legend states, are there another 174 treasure vaults still waiting to be discovered? Since the war, treasure hunters from across the world have scoured the Philippines in search of Yamashita's gold. Yet none of them have found anything. Nonetheless, people are still willing to risk their lives looking.
Searching for Yamashita's gold is a very dangerous activity. Even to this day, I think it was in 2000, 2 men were buried alive looking for treasure.
What drives them is their certainty that Yamashita's gold is still out there.
The legend of Yamashita's gold in the Philippines is huge, and it hasn't died.
It endures because it's real, because there really are burial sites. There really is gold bars, gold dishes, gold treasures that are still to be found in the islands of the Philippines.